zaposlen sam u socijaldemokratskoj političkoj fondaciji Friedrich Ebert. Današnje okupljanje je nastavak takozvanog sindikalnog foruma koju je fondacija Friedrich Ebert zajedno sa Centrom za razvoj sindikalizma započela još prošle godine. Radi se dakle o seriji debata koje za prevashodni cilj imaju oživljavanje sindikalnog diskursa u Srbiji i jačanje sindikalnog pokreta. Hvala vam što aktivnim učešćem podržavate ovu ideju. Sindikati su već nekoliko decenija konfrontirani sa gubitkom članstva, slabljenjem pregovaračke moći i političkog uticaja. Ekonomska kriza je samo dodatno pogoršala ovaj problem. Čini se da se uvek od tih naših skupova prošle godine nametalo jedno osnovno pitanje: kako revitalizovati sindikalni pokret. U evropskoj teoriji sindikata se u poslednjih nekoliko godina razvio čitav niz pristupa pri oživljavanju sindikalnog pokreta. Upravo da bi se bolje upoznali sa tim pristupima na evropskom nivou, da bi procenili njihovu delotvornost, njihovu upotrebljivost u kontekstu u kome delujemo, organizovali smo ovaj skup. Drago mi je što ćemo danas imati upravo gosta koji u svojim naučnim radovima, u svojim tekstovima zastupa tezu da sindikati upravo nisu osuđeni na defanzivu, na zaborav, na marginu, nego kaže da i u nepovoljnim vremenima postoji puno prostora za strategijski izbor i za inovativne odgovore. To je profesor Emeritus sa Engleske škole za ekonomiju i političke nauke, profesor Richard Hyman, i sa njim fondacija sarađuje i na raznim projektima. Jedan oblik te saradnje je prevod studije koje imate na vašim stolovima. Posle uvodnog predavanja i razgovora sa profesorom Hymanom organizovat ćemo panel debatu sa predstavnicima sindikata iz Srbije, članica Evropske konfederacije sindikata, i želeo bih da pozdravim Duška Vukovića, potpredsednika Samostalnog sindikata Srbije i potpredsednika UGS Nezavisnost, profesora Zorana Stojikovića. Debatu će voditi jedan od najboljih poznavalaca sindikalne scene u Srbiji, sociolog Srećko Mihajlović, saradnik Centra za razvoj sindikalizma. Sada par reči o profesoru Hymanu. Dakle, profesor Hyman je već nekoliko decenija jedna od najpoznatijih figura u oblasti istraživanja industrijskih odnosa u Evropi i u Britaniji i Evropi. Richard Hyman završava osnovne i doktorske studije na Univerzitetu u Oksfordu, posle angažmana na katedri za industrijske odnose na Univerzitetu u Warwicku, prelazi na Londonsku školu za ekonomiju gde stiče titulu profesora Emeritusa. Profesor je osnivač i urednik Evropskog žurnala za industrijske odnose i tokom svoje akademske karijere bio je član uređivačkih odbora mnogih naučnih časopisa. Opširno se bavio temama kao što su komparativni industrijski odnosi, kolektivno pregovaranje, sindikalizam, industrijski konflikti, politike tržišta rada. Napisao je na desetine knjiga i stotine stručnih radova. Njegova komparativna studija Razumevanje evropskog sindikalizma između tržišta, klase i društva iz 2001. i knjiga Sindikati u Evropi, teška vremena, teški izbori su među najcitiranijim izvorima u ovoj oblasti i motivisale su generacije studenta, istraživača i aktivista da sagledaju radne odnose u širem društvenom i političkom kontekstu. Profesore, hvala što ste večeras sa nama u Beogradu. Izvolite.
Good morning, dobro jutro. I'd like to thank you for your introduction, and I'd like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for inviting me here today. And I'd like to invite all of you for being here, because it's always very refreshing to talk to an audience of trade unionists and not simply of students. And clearly, trade unions face enormous problems, as we heard in the introduction, in different ways in different countries. There are no simple answers, but at the end of the day, responses have to be in our own hands as trade unionists, speaking to each other, learning from each other. And that is certainly the basis on which I will be talking to you today. As we've heard, the title of my talk is one which was given by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung when, with two colleagues, Magdalena Benatsiak and Rebecca Gumville McCormick, I wrote a paper 2 or 3 years ago trying to summarize what is happening in the world of trade unionism and looking for good examples of how unions have reacted imaginatively to the challenges. This stemmed from a book I wrote with Rebecca Gumville McCormick, which looked at 10 West European countries. And one of the people in the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung said, it's very refreshing to read a book about trade unions which is not just a tale of woe. And that is certainly our intention. And so for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, we brought in our colleague with the background in Central and Eastern Europe to enlarge the coverage and to try to draw some broader arguments about what can be done even in very difficult circumstances. The themes I want to address are, first of all, looking very broadly at European trade unions. As we've heard, in many respects they've become weaker, but in very different ways. And this weakness is not necessarily terminal. It can be turned around. I'll say something about the challenges and the shocks which have faced European trade unions, both West and East, and some of the ways in which unions in different countries have responded. And I will end by trying to draw some conclusions. I put a question mark here because this is a continuing story. It would be wrong to say we have come up with all the answers. We have to continue the debate. So that is my agenda. It's hard to deny that almost universally in Europe, trade unions are weaker than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And there's a number of ways that one can indicate this. The simplest one perhaps is membership figures, union density, the proportion of the workforce which is unionized. And in only 2 or 3 of the 30 or more countries in Western, Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe is the story not one of quite considerable membership density decline. And clearly, to the extent that unions depend on members to pay money to help maintain the organisation, membership decline means a loss of financial resources as well. For many reasons, and I'll go into this, membership decline is associated with a loss of bargaining power, and in many countries also of political influence, because governments tend not to take trade unions as seriously when they don't speak for very many people. and how this can be turned around is a major challenge in many countries. And more difficult to assess, but certainly in many countries, the public legitimacy of trade unions has been reduced. In many of the countries of the West, trade unions are often seen and depicted by hostile newspapers and television commentators as representatives of a relatively privileged minority of workers. In most of the countries of Eastern Europe, trade unions have never fully recovered from the taint associated with being part of the transmission belt system of the old regime. But if we say that trade unions have been suffering in the last 20 or 30 years, there are marked contrasts in how severely they have been affected, and also in when the membership decline and other elements of decline actually began. And particularly in Western Europe, there is a marked difference between trends in membership density on the one hand and trends in collective bargaining coverage on the other. And I'll just show two slides which indicate this. Here, for a selection of European countries, are some figures for union density. I don't have figures for Serbia because none of the various comparative indicators actually believe that they can get hold of reliable figures for Serbia. But I think the story, if one had the figures, would show something relatively similar. We see, particularly in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, from more or less universal membership before the transition, now a situation of greater or lesser collapse. Sorry. I mean, Estonia is the example here on this screen, going down like that. That is an extreme case, but one which indicates a broader trend, I think. If one looks at Poland, oops. This thing doesn't seem to like the laser. With Poland going down like this. A few countries of Western Europe have seen a similar decline, but in many countries, much greater stability. Nevertheless, if one looks at today's figures, one sees 4 countries in Europe with a unionisation rate, a density rate far above the rest, and those are the 3 Nordic countries here: Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Belgium, which is the one non-Nordic country in Western Europe which still has roughly 50% union membership. And there are special reasons for this which I could discuss, but I won't take time doing now. But this is the chart of union density. If one looks at the coverage of collective bargaining one sees a very different pattern. Many countries which have very few union members have most workers still covered by collective agreements. The exceptions to this rule out of this chart are what one might call the Anglo-Saxon countries, Britain and Ireland, and the countries of Eastern Europe. And there's an easy explanation for this. In much of Western Europe, collective agreements still cover most workers because, first of all, there is multi-employer bargaining, so that employers, even when they are not including very many union members, nevertheless sign up to collective agreements. And secondly, various extension rules whereby governments make collective agreements binding on the whole workforce of a sector or industry, whether or not their employers individually are bound by the agreement. And where this exists, which is most of the countries there, bargaining coverage is not dependent on union membership. The exceptions to this are, first of all, countries like Britain, where multi-employer bargaining ceased to exist 20 or 30 years ago, and the countries, of course, of Eastern Europe, where strong employers' organisations and strong industry-level agreements are the exception, very much the exception rather than the rule. So here we see an interesting disparity in most European countries between union membership on the one hand, bargaining coverage on the other. And this is important because many would say that unions achieved a state of false security because they felt they could still do their job of collective bargaining whether or not their membership was holding up. And this sense of complacency has been a major reason, I think, why unions in many countries have been rather slow to respond to the challenges they're facing. But they have been responding, even if belatedly, partly because of the new threats which have affected them in more recent years. And there are a variety of challenges and threats which take different forms in different countries. I said that the highest unionisation rates are in the Nordic countries and in Belgium, and these countries traditionally have had systems of unemployment insurance administered by the trade unions themselves, and this gave workers an incentive and encouragement to join a union because then the union handled their unemployment benefits. And this is often called the Ghent system after the town of that name in Belgium where this originated. But in the Nordic countries in particular, governments in the last 10, 15 years have seriously weakened these systems, and as a consequence one has seen a significant decline in union membership in recent years. Nordic unions are still the strongest in numerical terms in Europe, but the figures have shown a significant decline. Virtually everywhere we have the problem that the so-called atypical workers, those not on permanent full-time contracts, have become increasingly typical. The core workforce that unions in most countries have traditionally represented has been shrinking, and unions face the challenge. How do we go about bringing the expanding precarious workforce into union representation? Because if we don't, we're doomed perhaps to decline. In countries with strong centralised bargaining, there has been a trend towards increasing decentralisation, a shift from multi-employer bargaining to individual company bargaining. And this raises significant problems of maintaining adequate organisation at workplace level and of coordinating the bargaining activities of representatives in each company. And linked to this, the threat of employers to close down and move elsewhere if unions don't make concessions in terms of the gains which over previous decades they'd won. People often said that Western European countries were coordinated market economies, which is what this initial CME means, that there were very strong institutions regulating the market so that it was not simply the operation of supply and demand, but that there were rules, and that these rules in particular protected the weak, protected workers, protected those with limited bargaining power. But the whole American idea of shareholder value, inculcated in business schools across Europe today, has become very much the norm for company practice in many countries. And unions therefore can no longer rely on the sort of social regulation which they took for granted in the past, in Western Europe at least. And much more generally, the rise of neoliberalism, the reduction in unions' political influence, have tended to marginalise trade unions, and economic crisis and the imposition of austerity have reinforced this trend. And finally, one should mention what one writer has called illusory corporatism in Central and Eastern Europe, that as part of the conditions of accession to the European Union, countries were expected to adopt the mechanisms of social dialogue, and therefore in most countries some sort of tripartite structure was set up, but these were usually fake organisations with no real impact, no real functioning, and that has been increasingly eliminated even in form, and unions increasingly excluded from social policy making and labour market policy making. And these are radical challenges, and they raise the question, do unions simply do the best with what they've got, try to hang on to their declining core constituency, or do they try to act proactively in order to turn the situation round? And in most countries one finds intense debates among trade unions about strategic renewal. how can we do things better and differently? What are the requirements for turning the corner, for winning back members, for winning back public respect? And there have been a variety of responses which show some movement towards trade union renewal. And let me just address a few of these. The organising model was a concept developed in the United States, which said, in effect, unions have concentrated too much on providing services for their existing members. What they need to do is to go out and get new members and not simply recruit them, but organise them into some sort of collective force so that they can play a major role in defending and improving their own conditions. And this has had an impact in a wide range of European countries, both West and East. It's meant, for example, unions having to address constituencies that in the past they've neglected. Women in most countries have been underrepresented in trade unionism, but major shifts in the attempt to which women are not only recruited but involved in policy making, involved in union leadership. Precarious workers, migrant workers, young workers, a particular challenge because in most countries young workers are far less likely to be union members than those who are aged 40, 50 or older. We have an extreme case, interestingly, in Italy, where half of current union members are actually retired already. But in many other countries, at least half the current membership is aged 50 or more and won't be in the union all that much longer. So that is a major challenge. And the organising approach has been adopted in different ways in many countries. In my own country, the Trade Union Congress set up what it called an organising academy back in 1998, which brought in a core of activists each year, a couple of dozen, with a background either as workplace level union representatives or in some case as activists within social movements, NGOs, without a specific trade union background, and provided a mix of structured training and experience working for a specific trade union. And the recruits to the organising academy were taken to a high degree from ethnic minorities. They tended to be about 50% women to maintain a gender balance. Because part of the argument that the American organising model developed was that, like recruits, if you want to go out and organise young black women workers, you have to have a young black woman is the best place to go out and talk to them and speak to them, understand their concerns and get them in the union. And this approach has been adopted with some success, I think, in Britain, where at least union decline has been reversed, has been stopped, even if we haven't seen much expansion yet. In Germany, two examples. The campaign of Verdi, the service sector union against the Lidl supermarket, and the campaign of IG Metall to try and recruit and regulate the very rapidly expanding use of agency workers in core metalworking manufacturing. In the Netherlands, a very interesting strike, the longest Dutch strike since the 1930s, which involved cleaners at Schiphol Airport and also in the National Railways. A strike which involved primarily precarious women workers of migrant origin, which stemmed from a long preparation to win their confidence and their self-confidence, and which was ultimately successful. An example from Eastern Europe, the fight against junk contracts by the unions in Poland. All these have been quite effective attempts to apply an organising approach. Organising has clear benefits, as it also has costs. It's expensive, and in particular if one tries to organise precarious workers, they're unlikely still to be in the union a year down the road because they've moved on to a different job or to unemployment. And a more important question, is organising just a toolkit? Is it just a set of recipes that you can apply and draw the benefits? Or does it involve a new understanding of what trade unionism is about, what we are here for as trade unionists? And I'll come back to this as I conclude. To approach organising seriously, we have to ask, what does it mean to be a trade union? What are we here for? What are our objectives? What is our social mission? Whose interests are we trying to serve? How, given that all unions claim to be democratic, how do we make that a reality? How does union democracy work in practice? All these questions are linked to the idea of an organising model. More briefly, let me say a bit about collective bargaining in hard times. As I said a moment ago, for unions accustomed to multi-level bargaining with employers' associations, where they have a stable counterpart on the other side and understand each other, decentralisation is a major challenge. You need strong workplace organisation, and in many countries that simply does not exist. And in hard times, people often don't come forward to act as workplace representatives because they think they will be victimised by the employer. And how does one prevent downwards pressure on conditions and standards if bargaining is workplace by workplace, where in a sense the weakest company in terms of union organisation sets the benchmark that others are forced to follow? A radical challenge without an easy solution. Is there an alternative to concession bargaining? And we see concession bargaining even where unions are relatively strong. In Germany, the threat by motor manufacturers to pull out of German production without concessions has led to a whole range of givebacks of gains made previously. In Italy, Fiat as an exemplary case, the car manufacturer, which was once the iconic Italian company, now an Italian-American company, whose management aggressively pursue a downwards development in employment conditions, and where at least two of the main unions have been willing to go along with this to gain an advantage over their rival. Economic and monetary union has seriously affected collective bargaining by encouraging wage moderation. And we see this almost universally in a substantial decline in the wage share of national income since monetary union was introduced. And crisis and austerity, which I mentioned a moment ago, have faced trade unions with very difficult dilemmas. Do they accommodate or do they resist? Do they seek to negotiate the least amount of pain, or do we say someone else should be taking the pain? And often this has led to differences, divisions, conflicts between different unions within a single country. After this catalogue of difficulties and challenges, it's important to say that there have been innovative responses within this field of collective bargaining. And let me just give a few examples. The shift from quantity to quality, the idea of good work, is one which has been taken up in many countries. Workers are obviously concerned about the pay packet, but not only that. They want a decent job, they want to be treated with respect, they want to feel that they are doing something worthwhile. And engaging with employers to try to achieve better quality in work has been one area of innovation in many countries. One specific example of this is the whole issue of stress. Unions have come to realise that stress is a major threat to the well-being and health of workers across a whole range of employments, and the trend to try to negotiate agreements to reduce or eliminate stress has been a very important development in the last decade in many countries. And the broader issue of work-life balance, I always use this in inverted commas because I think it's a misleading term, because work should be part of life. There shouldn't be one sphere here and one sphere there. But to mean that the demands of work don't destroy your capacity to enjoy other elements of your social and domestic existence has been, again, a major demand taken up in collective bargaining. The idea of flexibility, which has been in the main a demand of employers and neoliberal governments to say that protections for workers should be reduced or eliminated. This can to some degree be turned on its head by demanding flexibility for workers, because the whole idea of a standard one-size-fits-all set of employment regulations doesn't necessarily match workers' aspirations today, and to try to negotiate flexibility which acts in workers' interests, which gives workers choice rather than giving management choice, this again has been taken up in interesting ways in a number of countries. and we describe some of these in the pamphlet. The German Metalworkers Union has pursued a campaign which it called Besser statt billiger, better rather than cheaper, encouraging reshaping the organisation of work so that it is both more productive but also more satisfying for workers themselves, and in the process engaging local representatives in negotiating over the reorganisation of production, and in this way helping to build capacity, collective capacity at workplace level. In many ways, all these different kinds of initiatives reflect what one trade union theorist and activist has called a role as constructive veto players. Trade unions are often criticised for being purely negative. Redefining trade unionism as a way of saying these are our positive proposals for how to organise work, how to improve production, how to make the company or the national economy more effective. There should be common sense in the interests of workers as well as employers and governments. So we'll work with you on this agenda. But if you don't agree to work with us, then we're prepared to say no and fight against you. And the notion that it is not simply a choice between being oppositional or being collaborative, that you can involve both of these in, if you like, a contradictory synthesis. This is one of the arguments which has acquired considerable force in trade unions in recent years. Political engagement and social dialogue, a very sensitive issue, particularly in the countries east of the old Iron Curtain. If we look in the West, the traditional links between unions and parties have been substantially reduced over past decades. 50 years ago, all the main unions had very close and sometimes formal linkages to one or other political party. Almost universally, these formal alliances have been removed, and in many cases the informal linkages have been seriously weakened, in particular where supposedly socialist or social democratic governments have pursued an agenda which attacks workers' interests. So politically, unions in the West have become much more autonomous. As I said a moment ago, the reaction to transmission belt unionism in the East has tended to mean a widespread suspicion of any political role. The question arises, however, can trade unions be non-political? If it's governments that define the framework of labour law, if governments shape employment and labour market policy, if governments manage the social welfare regime, if governments often are major employers of trade union members, trade unions can't be fully detached from the political process. And the key question has been, how can trade unions be political actors, but not necessarily in the traditional way? In some ways, neoliberalism has compelled trade unions to say, if we don't like neoliberal policies, what is our alternative? We can't just say no. We have to spell out a set of social and economic policies which are different and better, and which ordinary workers, ordinary voters recognise as being different and better. What new vision for society as a whole can trade unions present? And this is a political question, even if it's not political in the traditional sense. The crisis and the austerity have often involved the collapse or the erosion of social partnership, which has been a main support of trade unions in many countries. One example is in Ireland, where after 30 years of 5-year national social pacts, the whole edifice collapsed with the imposition of austerity. And in many ways, tripartite social dialogue was a comfortable, warm bath, one might say, in which trade unions embraced a political role which was based on the pursuit of consensus. With crisis and austerity, consensus becomes more difficult. How can trade unions pursue the agenda in a different way? And this has led to a search for new alliances and for new arguments for social justices. How can unions win back popular respect and popular support? How can they engage young people in particular, who in most countries have been very active in different kinds of social movements and NGOs, non-governmental organisations, but are often very unlikely indeed to see a trade union as an attractive organisation for meeting their needs and interests. Trade unions face a very difficult task of cooperation with new social movements. In the past, most trade unions have been very suspicious of NGOs, of social movements, because they're seen as being not subject to the sorts of formal democracy that have been embedded in trade unionism. Then they're seen as anarchic, spontaneous, unpredictable. But in many ways, I think trade unions have come to see maybe we as trade unions need a bit more anarchy, a bit more spontaneity, a bit more unpredictability, and the willingness of some trade unions to try to engage in new and imaginative types of activity, in using social media as a means of organisation, in being willing to stage colourful protests, in using flash mobs, forms of actions which gain public attention and public engagement. This has to be part of the process of winning back influence and impact. And to conclude, are trade unions regaining the initiative? As I said earlier, to renew trade unionism, we have to redefine what trade unionism is about. What are the aims? How can we reconstruct a constituency of trade union members which is more diverse, but nevertheless is united in a sense of solidarity? How can we come up with new and imaginative methods? part of the difficulty is that unions can often be very bureaucratic organisations with their own routines, their own procedures, their fear of the unknown. And at the same time, unions are organisations which contain many internal vested interests which can block change. A key question is building strategic capacity. And this is partly a question of having resources, certainly, but also of what has been called resourcefulness, making the most effective use of what are now more limited resources, defining clearly what are the priorities and concentrating on those. And often companies say that the workers are our main resource. Unions have to say the members are our main resource. And if you don't have the money, you have to inspire the activists and get the activists to inspire the membership as a whole. And that means that unions have to rethink their own democracy and make their decision-making, policy-making much more transparent and much more embracing of people who don't just want to go to boring meetings, but nevertheless want to have their say. Solidarity has to be the continuing message of trade unions, but we have to make it more than just a slogan in times when solidarity is often more difficult than ever. And at the end of the day, a crisis can be an opportunity. But to make crisis an opportunity, unions have to win acceptance that they defend broader societal interests. And it seems to me there are three things they have to do. They have to engage with popular anger. The argument embraced in Italian in this slogan, we are not going to pay for the crisis. They have to present a progressive alternative. Here, German metal workers together for a good life. And they have to inspire hope and enthusiasm. Here in French, the slogan, I don't doubt if many of you probably speak French, but the slogan on the brass horn is a play on words. The French for general strike is grève générale. This says rêve général, which means general dream. Trade unions need to have a dream. Trade unions in Europe, I think, are attempting to develop a dream, and I hope that here too in Serbia, you as trade unionists will also fashion an attractive dream. Thank you very much.